We saw this this fall in both September and October, really high numbers of painted ladies. And the reason I think that we saw so many is that they had an earlier start than normal. So if you remember back into March of 2017, it got really warm and we had an early spring. It did get cool again, but what that allowed for is for butterflies that were currently present here in Colorado to come out of their dormancy, and for butterflies that would migrate into this area, like the painted lady, to potentially come in earlier. And then they had a longer season in which to mate. And then they were able to reproduce at high numbers, and then that population explosion that we saw in September or October was most likely a result of that.
Butterflies are just one of the many species on the move due to climate change. In the Western Hemisphere alone, nearly 3,000 species of animals are on the move to more hospitable locations, which are often cooler. In turn, mountain ranges and hills tend to be more important for migrating species. Those migrating along the east coast tend to travel longer distances to find cooler environments, while species in the west can simply migrate up hills.
Climate change is ultimately affecting species that are found in very limited numbers at very specific locations at higher elevations. That's definitely where we're seeing the biggest impact of climate change. For example, here in Colorado, we have the Uncompahgre fritillary, which is found in southwestern Colorado in the Uncompahgre area, mountain range. And they are found where their plants are located, and those plants are fairly patchy, and there are very high elevations, and once a patch disappears, they then have to find another patch. They might not find one, and eventually the question does become, will there be any patches left? So those are the species that are the most heavily impacted. Now, there's definitely going to be impact on species who migrate, long distance migrators, like the monarch. And in Mexico, they are actually migrating to very specific forests that are kind of northwest of Mexico City. And interestingly enough, this is not an area of Mexico that's considered hot during the winter months. It's fairly cool, and these forests are at higher elevations. So where the butterflies are going are very unique forests, and they have what we consider a microclimate, or the correct amount of moisture, the correct amount of light, the correct amount of plant material that they need in order to overwinter there. So they stay there approximately 6 months. Well, those plants, or that microclimate, including the plants, including the humidity and temperature, is definitely at risk with climate change. And what we could see happen is that if that environment shifts, it becomes warmer, it has less moisture, it doesn't have the plants they need, then it might not be a suitable site for the monarchs to overwinter. And then the question becomes, can they find another suitable site? Is there another place? Or can they physiologically adapt to be in that area?
What you're interested in are how climate change has affected the food chain. So you can go back, there actually are records on the East Coast going back to the time of Walt Whitman and Walden Pond about when flowers bloom in specific places like Cape Cod, for example. And since 1960, there has been a progressive shift towards, on the East Coast, plants blooming earlier. And by earlier, it's as much as a week in advance. And there was an article in the New York Times, Sunday edition, about a week ago that went through how this is affecting a whole variety of ecosystems. Initially, the idea that if things are warming up, that means, for example, plants can spread to more northern latitudes. Well, that sounds good, except when you have a plant-animal relationship where the animal is expecting the plant to, for example, flower at a particular time. If the animal isn't there, because its development has not progressed in step, then you're going to miss your pollination. So there is evidence on the East Coast for pollinators and their flowering plants to be out of sync. So what that's doing in the long run is the populations of these plants, for example, are going down because they're not getting pollinated with the same efficiency as they did, say, 40 or 50 years ago. And the plants are flowering earlier because of the warmer climates are coming earlier. So that's one instance. Now, this allows some animals to move into new ranges. So it's all a question of coordination. Do you have predators matching up to their prey at the right time? And if you do, that's fine. But if you don't, now things are off. And so I think that's one of the major concerns, is that there are going to be plant species and animal species that benefit from warmer temperatures, but there's going to be a lot that will not.
It can be difficult for the prey and the predator to match up at the right time in the right place. Plants in particular may end up taking a different migration direction altogether compared to migrating animals. While animals may seek cooler microclimates, plants may seek a microclimate that favors precipitation. A study in 2014 revealed that more than 60% of plants studied across western North America migrated downward. Higher, drier conditions prove unfavorable for these plants, preferring increased water availability in exchange for warmer conditions. Animals may need to find a unique way to adapt to these unusual circumstances in the chase for food.
So the monarch butterfly does this amazing migration covering 3 different countries, and that is unique. But short distance migrations are fairly common, and the reason for that is that they're following a food source. And for butterflies as adults, they feed on nectar from flowers primarily, or at least here in the US. When you get down into the tropics, you do have a lot of butterflies that are feeding on decaying fruit that may fall on the forest floor. But here in the US, you're going to see mainly butterflies feeding on plant material, the nectar source as adult. And then as caterpillars, the 2 stages prior to the adult, they're feeding on the leaves of plants. So plants are their livelihood. They have this very unique relationship with plants that's very important. So they may move distances that would be considered a migration because of the search for their food source. And this is oftentimes seen along an elevational gradient, where you have a butterfly that's seen at a high elevation, and let's say that winter comes and that higher elevation is going to lose its plant material first because of the cooler weather. So that butterfly is going to migrate down slope and into lower elevations where the food is still available. One thing that we've seen with the monarch butterfly is that wind patterns ultimately affect the migration. So we know really well from research that monarchs follow a flight path when they are leaving their northern regions of their migration. So they are found in the southern areas of Canada and the northern areas of the US, and they're going to be going down to Mexico in the fall. So they've already done their mass migration for this year. And we know that migration primarily follows what we consider the Corn Belt of the US and also portions of the eastern US. And for example, like here in Colorado, we don't see the massive waves of migrations that they do see further east of us. However, if there's a weather pattern that disrupts the winds that are helping carry those butterflies south, that might push them over into an area maybe further west, like here in Colorado, or maybe it pushes them east. So weather patterns can be something that affects migration, and that would happen on a very short time scale. But going back to the discussion of plants, this could be something that affects the migration over a longer time. So you may have plants that were found at higher elevations at one point in time, but due to climate change, those areas no longer are suitable for those plants, so they can no longer grow there. So butterflies may be doing this in some ways may not even be considered a migration, but could factor into a migration. They may have to be shifting up and down, or primarily down an elevational gradient because of the loss of plants at higher elevations.
In a way, butterflies may be the most resilient to climate change given their unique migration patterns. Yet, even they are subject to wind and weather patterns. As species are pushed into new territory, humans experience the consequences of these migrations, for better or worse. Shrubs may be among the first plants to move, bringing moose hundreds of miles out to northern Alaska, where they became a source of sustenance for indigenous hunters. Hybrid species, such as toads and trouts, have been documented as a result of climate change gradually pushing in two species from potentially different climates. In brief, something as beautiful as the sudden migration of butterflies in Colorado may serve as a dire warning of what may soon come.